They were given the cast-offs, the bones, the weeds, the organs no one else would touch. But from these scraps, enslaved Africans created something extraordinary. They created nourishment. They created culture. They created survival. Today on The America We Forget, we journey into the kitchens of the enslaved. Not the grand plantation houses, but the dirt floor cabins, the open fires, the iron pots. We uncover 10 of the strangest survival foods, dishes that may seem bizarre today, but were sacred acts of resilience, creativity, and ancestral memory. These meals weren't just about staying alive. They were about staying human. 1. Dandelion greens. Bitterness and freedom. They weren't planted. They weren't harvested in neat rows. They grew wild, stubborn, bitter, and free. Dandelion greens were never part of the plantation menu, but for the enslaved, they were a lifeline. Found along fence lines, in the cracks of the earth, and at the edges of fields, these greens were foraged in quiet moments, a stolen act of survival, boiled to soften their bite, seasoned with salt pork or fat back when available. Dandelion greens became a staple in the cabins of the enslaved. They were tough, earthy, unrefined, but they were nourishing, rich in vitamins, iron, and the kind of strength that doesn't come from comfort. To eat dandelion greens was to reclaim something from the land, to say, we still know how to live off the earth. We still know how to endure. They were more than food. They were a symbol of resilience, of resourcefulness, and of a freedom that could not be fully taken. 2. Boiled cow tongue. Silence turned into sustenance. It was the part no one wanted, the tongue, thick, muscular, and unsettling to the eye. To the enslavers, it was waste. To the enslaved, it was dinner. Boiled cow tongue was cleaned, simmered for hours, and sliced thin. It was chewy, dense, and rich with iron, a cut that required patience and skill to prepare. Sometimes served cold, sometimes stewed with onions and herbs, it became a dish of quiet dignity. But the symbolism ran deeper. The tongue, the organ of speech, was served in a world where the enslaved were forbidden to speak freely, where language was policed, where silence was survival. To eat the tongue was to reclaim voice, to say, we may be silenced, but we still nourish ourselves. We still remember who we are. It was strange. It was sacred. It was survival. 3. Wild onion and garlic soup. Medicine from the margins. It wasn't served in bowls of porcelain. It didn't simmer in plantation kitchens. It was brewed in iron pots over open flames, with ingredients gathered from the edges of survival. Wild onion and garlic, pungent, sharp, and healing, were foraged from fields, forests, and fence lines. These weren't garden crops. They were medicine. They were memory. Boiled into a thin broth, this soup was more than food. It was a remedy for aching bodies, for fevers, for exhaustion. It was a comfort in the cold, a whisper of care in a world that offered none. The enslaved knew the land. They knew which roots to pull, which bulbs to crush, which leaves to steep. And in this humble soup, they preserved centuries of African herbal knowledge, passed down in secret, spoken in kitchens, remembered in silence. To drink wild onion and garlic soup was to heal, to remember, to resist. 4. Roasted pumpkin seeds. Hidden nourishment in the hollow. The pumpkin was grown for the flesh. The seeds were tossed aside, slimy, slippery, forgotten. But for the enslaved, those seeds were treasure, roasted over open flame or baked in. The ashes of a dying fire, pumpkin seeds became a quiet source of strength, crunchy, nutty, packed with oil and protein. They were eaten by the handful, carried in cloth pouches, or ground into paste when food was scarce. This wasn't just snacking. It was survival tucked inside a shell, a way to extract nourishment from what others ignored. And in their simplicity, roasted pumpkin seeds held something sacred, the ability to turn waste into sustenance, to find value in the hollow, to say, "We see what you don't. We survive where you wouldn't." They were small, but they were mighty. 5. Bone broth from scraps. Strength from the forgotten. The bones were tossed aside, stripped of meat, discarded like the people who labored in the fields. But the enslaved knew better. They knew that even bones held power. Bone broth was made from what others refused. Knuckles, joints, ribs, and vertebrae, simmered for hours, sometimes days, in iron pots over open flame. The marrow melted, the collagen thickened. The water turned golden, rich, and restorative. This wasn't just soup. It was strength extracted from the forgotten. It was nourishment pulled from the margins. In a world that gave them nothing, the enslaved made everything. They turned scraps into sustenance. They turned waste into wellness. And in every sip of bone broth, there was a message. We survive, we heal, we remember. It was strange, it was sacred, it was survival. 6. Foraged persimmons, sweetness from the wild. They weren't planted in neat rows. They weren't harvested under orders. They hung from wild trees, golden, soft, and waiting. Persimmons were foraged in the fall when their flesh turned sweet and their bitterness faded. To the enslaved, they were a rare indulgence, a fruit that needed no permission, no ration, no overseer's approval, eaten fresh, dried in the sun, or mashed into puddings and breads. Persimmons offered more than calories. They offered joy, a moment of sweetness in a life defined by labor and loss. But they were also a lesson in patience. Pick them too early and they burned the tongue with bitterness. Wait until the frost kissed them, and they melted like honey. To know persimmons was to know timing, to know the land, to know that even in a world of cruelty, nature still gave gifts. They were strange, they were sacred, they were survival. 7. Turnip root roast, Earth's humble offering. It grew beneath the soil, rough, knotted, and pale. The turnip root wasn't prized. It wasn't celebrated, but it endured. For the enslaved, turnip roots were a gift from the earth itself. Roasted over open flame or buried in hot coals, they softened slowly, releasing a subtle sweetness beneath their bitter skin. Sometimes eaten plain, sometimes mashed with lard or wild herbs. Always filling, always grounding, turnips were easy to grow, hard to kill, and stubborn in the face of frost. Much like the people who relied on them, to roast a turnip was to coax flavor from hardship. To say, we will make do. We will make more than do. It was a strange food, overlooked, underloved. But in the cabins and fields, it was a quiet comfort, a root that reminded them, even in the coldest season, something could still grow. 8. Okra and corn mash, Africa in every bite. 2 ingredients, one from the soil of the south, one carried across the ocean in memory. Okra and corn, mashed together, boiled slowly, thickened into a hearty blend. It wasn't fancy. It wasn't pretty. But it was powerful. Okra, with its slippery texture and deep green pods, was a crop brought from Africa, a botanical memory of home. Corn, cultivated on American soil, was the grain of survival. Together, they formed a dish that was both grounding and connective. The mash was served hot, often with bits of pork fat or wild herbs. It filled the belly. It soothed the spirit. And it reminded the enslaved that even in bondage, their roots ran deep. To eat okra and corn mash was to taste history, to feel the fusion of two worlds, one stolen, one endured. It was strange to outsiders, but to those who knew, it was sacred. It was Africa, still alive. In every bite. 9. Salt pork scraps, flavor from the edge. It was never the thick cuts, never the prized slabs. Just the scraps, fatty, salty, and tough. Salt pork scraps were the cast-offs, the trimmings, the pieces too small for the plantation table, but just enough to flavor a pot. For the enslaved, these scraps were gold. Boiled with beans, greens, or cornmeal, they transformed bland ingredients into meals that warmed the body and lifted the spirit. The salt preserved them, the fat enriched them, and the flavor, smoky, deep, and defiant, lingered long after the fire died. Salt pork wasn't just food. It was a tool, a way to stretch a meal, to feed a family, to make something from almost nothing. And in every pot it touched, there was a message. We will make this enough. We will make this ours. It was strange to some, but to those who knew, it was sacred. 10. Cowpea Stew, Seeds of Survival. It wasn't just a stew. It was a memory planted in foreign soil. Cowpeas, known today as black-eyed peas, were carried across the Atlantic in the holds of slave ships, tucked into braids, hidden in cloth, preserved in hope. They were more than food. They were heritage. On the plantation, cowpeas were grown in the margins, hardy, drought-resistant, and rich in protein. Stewed slowly with salt pork scraps, onions, and wild herbs, they became a staple in the cabins of the enslaved. Thick, earthy, nourishing. But every bowl told a story. Of West African fields, of stolen lives, of traditions that refused to die. To eat cowpea stew was to taste resistance, to feel the pulse of a culture that endured captivity but never surrendered its soul. It was strange to the enslavers, but to the enslaved it was sacred. It was survival, with roots. These foods weren't just strange, they were sacred. They were survival. They were stories told in flavor, stories of pain, creativity, and unbreakable spirit. They remind us that even in the darkest chapters of history, there was light. There was ingenuity. There was culture. If this journey opened your heart to the resilience behind the recipes, like this video to honor the legacy, share it with someone who believes food is history. Subscribe to The America We Forget for more stories that deserve to be remembered. Until next time, may your table carry memory.